All right, thanks, Joe. Let me share my screen here. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for attending today's webinar, What to Expect in the Design Process. Today, I'm going to dive deep into Aten's design process, where it fits in the overall timeline for our projects, and what to expect, both as a client and a collaborator. Like Joe said, I'm Ken Woodworth, Aten's VP of Design and a partner. In my 18+ years at Aten, I've led the design and strategy team to help create award-winning work for our clients and empowered organizations to leverage design to create meaningful experiences for their audiences. In all that time, the web has gone through a number of evolutionary steps that greatly impacted how we design for the screen. I began working on the web at a time when designs were sliced into pieces and laid out using tables and spacer GIFs. The web evolved to adopt new technologies like Flash to create amazing animations, interactions, and immersive experiences. With the advent of web standards, the web saw a shift in how we approached building web pages and designing for the web. In 2010, Ethan Marcotte penned an article titled "Responsive Design, Web Design," and broke the web from the paradigm of the printed page and forced us to accept the flexible nature of the medium. Around the same time, Luke Wroblewski was championing a new way of thinking about how to approach designing for the web, mobile first. A few years later, Brad Frost wrote Atomic Design, an article about building design systems instead of pages. From web typography to Flexbox and CSS Grid, to accessibility standards, to evolving JavaScript technologies, to new ways to write CSS, the list of advances that have impacted how we design for the web goes on and on. If designing for the web means designing for an ever-changing medium, how do we create a design process that can adapt to those changes? Well, before I get too far in talking about process, I wanted to start by talking about collaboration using a parable, the blind men and the elephant. There were 6 blind men who had only ever heard stories about elephants. They argued day and night about elephants, each making assumptions about elephants based on what they had heard. The villagers got sick of their arguing and arranged for them to visit the palace of the Raja to learn the truth about elephants. Upon reaching the palace, the old men were led to a courtyard where they could touch an elephant. The first blind man reached out and touched the side of the huge animal. "An elephant is smooth and solid like a wall," he declared. "It must be very powerful." The second blind man put his hand on the elephant's trunk. "An elephant is like a giant snake." The third man felt the elephant's tusk. "This creature is as sharp and deadly as a spear." The fourth blind man touched his leg and thought it was a cow. The fifth touched its ear and thought it was a fan or a flying carpet. And the sixth man grabbed its tail and said, "This is just a rope." Afterwards, the men began to argue again, each going back to their earlier assumptions about elephants. The Raja was awakened from his nap by all the shouting. "Stop shouting," he yelled. "How can each of you be so certain you are right? The elephant is a very large animal. Each man only touched one part. Perhaps if you put the parts together, you will see the truth." "He is right," said the first blind man. "To learn the truth, we must put all the parts together." So how does Aten put all of the parts together? And what does collaboration mean at Aten? Our team is made up of many different roles: project managers, strategists, designers, developers, both front end and back end, each with their own perspective. And all of these roles must collaborate together. But we take that a step further, and we work to include the client in as many parts of the process as possible. We cannot create successful products without active collaborative involvement from our clients. We have a one team, one dream mentality. We treat clients as if they are part of our team. We also choose tools to support collaboration. We have a number of tools we use to communicate collaboratively. We use Slack for day-to-day communication and quick conversations. We use Zoom for meetings, presentations, and for not so quick conversations. And we use Basecamp as a place to communicate about artifacts and keep a history of artifact-specific conversations. Well, how about design? When I started designing for the web, Photoshop was practically the only tool available. This photographer's tool had somehow become the de facto design tool for the web. Well, a lot has changed since then. A few years ago, Aten switched tools, making Sketch our primary design tool. Sketch allowed us to design holistically, working on multiple artboards at once. And today we use Figma. Figma is a powerful design tool with many of the same features as Sketch. It's web-based and has built-in collaboration features that let multiple people work together in the same file at the same time. It also has built-in prototyping, letting us move beyond static designs to interactive representations of our work. A built-in presentation feature lets us share designs with clients without having to move to another tool. We can even make edits during presentations that are represented live in the presentation. And the robust commenting features let us have conversations directly on our designs about specific points of feedback. So before I talk about the design process itself, I want to look at where design fits in a project's timeline. A typical web project is usually made up of a number of distinct phases. At Aten, we start with research and discovery. We need to understand the organization we're working with, their content, and their audiences. We then move on to strategy, where we establish goals and key performance indicators or metrics to measure the success of the project. We also identify top tasks users need to complete on the new site. We then use those goals to create an architecture that can be used as a blueprint in development. We create navigation structure, content structure, relationships between content, all of this to support the goals we've established and the needs of the users. Once we understand the strategic goals, the users we're building the site for, and the architecture to support those goals, this is where we begin design. At this point, we could start development based on what we already know. But design is not just style. It's not just something we apply. Designers don't just make things pretty. Design can have a huge impact on the decisions we've already made. I'll get into that a little bit more later. Once we've established enough design, we're ready to start development. So a traditional web project might follow a more waterfall approach, with each phase following in succession, starting with discovery, onto strategy, then architecture, design, and development, moving through the timeline. But at Aten, our process is a little different. After discovery, we focus on key phases, but realize that we need to involve the entire team in everything we do. Designers and developers are included in early strategy discussions and architecture decisions. Strategists and developers are involved throughout the design process, and strategists and designers are included in the development phase to support developers and review their work. Design is all about problem solving. So how do we take everything we've learned to discovery and all the strategic decisions we've made and support them with design? One way of thinking about a design process is big design up front. This approach is most commonly associated with a waterfall approach to software or web development. So you might say, let's figure out everything now before we get into development, then we don't have to worry about it later. But this approach has issues. What if you learn more information during development? What if the approaches that are established need to change? Looking back at that graphic from earlier, there's another way of thinking that might better describe our approach, called rough design up front. We design what we need to design to begin development, accepting that we don't know everything and that the things we create might change. We build design systems that document how to use type and color, how the grid system sets a framework for the design, and how to use space to create relationships and separation between content. We establish design direction that applies the design system to key pages to show how to use the design system and we explore how the design can adapt and shift across different screen sizes. So now I'd like to dive deep into Aten's design process. Aten has a user-centered design process that keeps the needs of the user in mind for everything we create. At its core, Aten's design process is flexible and iterative. It's flexible in that we do what makes the most sense for a project. We have specific steps we take in our design process, but each of those steps can be customized for each project's needs. It's iterative. We're feedback driven and always looking for input to wrap back into our work. We work really closely with clients in favor of secreting away and doing a big reveal. We aren't looking for, oh, wow, although that's nice to hear, but we are looking for, yes, this is what we wanted. We'll take any feedback we can get, but there are definitely different types of feedback. There's subjective feedback, like, I don't like this color. Prescriptive feedback, can you change the typeface for this heading? And objective user-focused feedback. Will our users know to click that button? There's value in all feedback, and sometimes you need to interpret it to understand what the person's actually saying. For example, when someone says, I don't like this color, maybe it's they don't like how much that color is being used, and that's offsetting the balance of the page. Or maybe it's giving focus to something that isn't as important as something else. There's all sorts of conversation that can come from feedback. So it's important to have an open mind during these steps to get the feedback you want and to really dig deep into where it's coming from. Our design process is tailored to create a design system that can grow and support content on any page of a client's site. Today, we're going to look at the design process for a project we recently launched for Ames Community College, ames.edu. We begin our design process with a series of design discovery workshops, starting with voice and tone and comparative analysis exercises. In voice and tone, we work to understand how best to visually represent a client's personality online. We do this in what we call a this but not that exercise. For Ames, these included supportive, not coddling, inspiring but not unrealistic, accessible but not easy, uncomplicated but not rudimentary, collegiate but not pompous. Now, these are important distinctions to make in establishing the personality of their website. One thing to note here, and you'll see it in that chart in the top left, is that we aren't looking for opposites. We're looking at the point at which a word goes too far. And that's an important distinction. That really helps us to identify the personality. So during this part of the process, and I'll do this for every step in our process, what are we looking for? What are we looking for from clients? It's important to have the key stakeholder group actively involved in this exercise. And if they're not part of that core team, communication directors or marketing managers often have very valuable input to add, particularly at this part of a project. Next, we move on to a comparative analysis exercise. This exercise helps us establish where the design we create should fit in a spectrum of possible directions. We'll look at the use of imagery and color, as well as typography and other elements specific to a client's project. But the examples aren't nearly as important as the conversation. These conversations set guideposts for future design work. For example, if a client is drawn to the use of white space in one of the examples we show, we can mention that later when talking about how we're using space in the designs we create. So at this part of the process, we're still gathering information. The more we learn, the better our chances for success. This is a great opportunity for generating ideas and coming to the table with new approaches and new things that we might want to try. And that brings us to what we call design exploration. This is our first chance to apply what we've learned to start building a foundation for the design. I like to start this step with an accessibility review of the brand color palette. This ensures that we start off on the right foot with accessibility, and it helps begin the conversation with the client around why it's important. It also helps identify colors that might need a small adjustment for the web. And we've often had to do that where there's a color in the client's palette that we need to shift just a little bit to make sure it meets those accessibility standards. If typefaces aren't already defined in a client's brand guidelines, we can explore type pairings and talk about how each can support some of the adjectives we identified in the voice and tone exercise. And then we move on to style tiles or element collages. These are sort of abstract representations of design. These let us look at elements of the design outside of the context of a page. Helps us focus on the details that make up the design without getting hung up on page structure or content. In this step, we often look at the typography and the use of color and imagery, and even animation or interaction. Here we can go wide and look at design from different angles. So what are we looking for? Well, at this point in the process, we really need to answer a few fundamental questions to make sure we're set up for success later. So are we representing the brand correctly? Do we need to do any work to make the brand's color palette accessible? Are we using color to convey the right meaning? Are there elements that are working or aren't working from the examples we've shown? Are the type choices appropriate? Things like that. All right, so in design exploration, we looked at the components that make up the design. In design direction, we look at building relationships between those components. We focus on key pages to establish page layout and grid structure, visual hierarchy, and navigation patterns. And we can still look at elements outside of their context too. The most important thing to keep in mind throughout this process is that we aren't designing 1 page or 5 pages or 1 million pages. We also aren't just designing for desktop computers. We want to create a design system that can grow and support our clients' content on any page of their website on any device. So this is often the place where the reality of what we're doing starts to set in. Up until now, we've been working in abstractions, asking our clients to imagine their new website without being able to see it. So we expect lots of feedback here. Hopefully, we get great design feedback that focuses on user needs and how the design solves problems. We often get feedback on content and structure too, but that's okay. One thing to note though is that it gets much harder to make sweeping changes the further along we get. So we really do want to make sure that we're focusing that feedback and getting the right feedback at the right time. Finally, we create design documentation to ensure developers have everything they need to apply the design. We document the design system in the form of a detailed style guide. This document outlines all colors and typefaces used in the design, different states for all interface elements, and shows all the different ways content can be displayed. It also outlines grid structure and how elements should align to that grid. On top of all this documentation, we do a number of meetings to make sure developers understand the designer's intent and can ask questions. So at this point in the process, this artifact's more developer-centric. But we do want to make sure that we've accounted for everything, that we've included how color should be used, the different states for interactive elements. Have we accounted for the ways that elements need to scale at different screen sizes? We want to make sure that we've documented as much as we can to give the developers the tools they need to continue building on this design in the browser. Once development begins, our designers work closely with our QA specialists to identify key pages and sections to QA. The QA specialist will handle day-to-day QA of smaller elements and then bring the designer back in for larger design reviews. So design really is about adding value. It's a strategic differentiator. And beyond that, it's a way to create meaningful experiences that engender loyalty and create sustained value for organizations. I love talking about design and design process, and would love to hear any questions. Thank you.